On the night of May 27, 1991, a naked 14-year-old boy stumbled out of an alleyway in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He was bleeding from his rectum. He was drugged, disoriented, and unable to speak. He collapsed onto the pavement, desperate for help. Two young women, neighbors from the apartment complex across the street, saw him. They immediately called the police, sensing that something was violently wrong. When the officers arrived, they found the boy. But they also found a man named Jeffrey Dahmer. Dahmer was calm. He was polite. He told the officers that the boy was actually 19 years old, that he was his boyfriend, and that they had simply had a lover's quarrel. He said the boy was drunk. The neighbors, specifically a woman named Glenda Cleveland, pleaded with the officers. She told them the boy was a child. She told them he was bleeding. She begged them to check the boy's identification. But the officers didn't listen. In a decision that would haunt the city of Milwaukee for decades, the police officers helped the stumbling, drugged boy back to his feet, and they walked him back into the apartment with Jeffrey Dahmer. They walked a victim back into the slaughterhouse. They closed the door and left. Inside that apartment, just moments after the police departed, Jeffrey Dahmer murdered Konerak Sinthasomphone. This wasn't just a failure of procedure. It was the fatal turning point in the story of the Milwaukee Cannibal. To understand how a nightmare of this magnitude could happen in plain sight, and how a serial killer could operate with such impunity that the police would literally return his victims to him, we have to peel back the layers of a story that is as much about systemic negligence as it is about individual evil. This is the story of Jeffrey Dahmer, but it is also the story of the victims who were ignored and the city that let a monster thrive in its shadows. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer did not start as a monster, or at least, he didn't appear to be one on the surface. Born in 1960, he grew up in Bath, Ohio. By all accounts, his early childhood was standard, but as he entered adolescence, fissures began to appear in his psyche. While other children were playing sports or riding bicycles, Dahmer developed a fascination with dead animals. He began collecting roadkill. He wasn't just looking at them. He was dissolving their flesh with acid to preserve the bones. He was fascinated by the internal mechanics of living things, and more importantly, he was fascinated by the idea of total control. Bones didn't leave. Bones didn't reject him. His home life was volatile. His parents' marriage was crumbling, filled with screaming matches and neglect. As Jeffrey retreated further into his own dark world, he began drinking heavily in high school to numb the noise in his head. But the fantasies were getting louder. He wasn't just thinking about roadkill anymore. He was thinking about a jogger who ran past his house every day. He fantasized about hitting him with a baseball bat and dragging him into the woods. He never acted on the jogger, but the threshold had been crossed. The fantasy of control was moving from animals to humans. In the summer of 1978, just weeks after his high school graduation, and with his parents in the middle of a messy divorce, Dahmer was left alone in the family home. He picked up a hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks. Hicks was just looking for a ride to a rock concert. Dahmer invited him back to the house for a beer. When Hicks tried to leave, the reality of Dahmer's abandonment issues snapped into place. He struck Hicks with a barbell and strangled him. This was the first kill. Dahmer was 18 years old. He dismembered the body and scattered the remains in the backyard. For 9 years, this murder would remain a secret. It was a dormant virus waiting to flare up again. Dahmer tried to be normal. He joined the army, but was discharged for his severe alcoholism. He moved to Miami, then back to Ohio, and finally to Milwaukee to live with his grandmother. This period living in his grandmother's house is often overlooked, but it is crucial. He was attending church with her on Sundays and drugging young men in her basement on Saturday nights. It was here that his modus operandi began to solidify. He would meet men at gay bars, offer them money to pose for photos, lure them back, and slip sleeping pills into their drinks. He wasn't just looking for sex. He was looking for a partner who couldn't leave. He wanted a zombie. Between 1987 and 1990, while living under the roof of a sweet, elderly woman who had no idea what was happening in her basement, Dahmer killed 3 more men. But his grandmother was getting suspicious of the smells and the late-night noises. In 1990, Dahmer moved out. He moved into the Oxford Apartments, Unit 213. This is where the story descends into true madness. The Oxford Apartments were located in a low-income, predominantly African-American neighborhood. Dahmer, a white man, stuck out, but he kept to himself. However, he couldn't hide the smell. Neighbors constantly complained of a stench like rotting meat coming from his vents. He told them his freezer was broken. He told the landlord he had spoiled meat. He was charming, manipulative, and seemingly harmless. But inside apartment 213, he was building a factory of death. He had a blue 57-gallon drum in his bedroom. He had specialized chemicals. He had a shrine of skulls inside his closet. Between 1990 and 1991, the rate of his killing accelerated drastically. He wasn't just killing to silence them anymore. He was killing to create. He began experimenting with drilling holes into the skulls of his living victims and injecting acid or boiling water into their brains. He was trying to induce a permanent vegetative state. He didn't want them dead. He wanted them mindless and compliant. He wanted total possession. This brings us back to the most critical and tragic juncture of the Dahmer case. The night of May 27, 1991. The night of Konerak Sinthasomphone. Konerak was the younger brother of a boy Dahmer had molested years prior, a crime for which Dahmer had actually served a brief, lenient sentence. The family had fled Laos seeking a better life in America, only to cross paths with Dahmer twice. On that night, Dahmer had lured Konerak into his apartment and performed his horrific drilling procedure. But Dahmer made a mistake. He left the apartment to buy more beer. While he was gone, Konerak, despite the damage to his brain, woke up. He stumbled out of the apartment, naked and bleeding, into the alley. When the police arrived, they were presented with 2 narratives. On one side, 2 black women, Glenda Cleveland and her niece, shouting that this was a child in distress. On the other side, Jeffrey Dahmer, a calm, white male, claiming this was a domestic dispute between adult lovers. The officers, John Balserzak and Joseph Gabrish, made a judgment call based on prejudice and apathy. They saw a gay lovers' quarrel in a bad neighborhood, and they wanted to wash their hands of it. They didn't run a background check on Dahmer. If they had, they would have seen his previous conviction involving Konerak's older brother. They didn't check Konerak's ID. They simply believed the white man over the concerned black women. The police audio from that night is chilling. After they left Konerak in Dahmer's hands, the officers radioed in to their dispatcher, laughing about the boyfriend-boyfriend dispute they had just handled. They joked about needing to get deloused. Meanwhile, inside apartment 213, the door was locked and Konerak's fate was sealed. This incident is the anchor of the Dahmer tragedy because it reveals that he was not a criminal mastermind. He was sloppy. He left victims alive. He had bodies decomposing in his apartment. He used a hacksaw in a thin-walled building. He was caught literally red-handed. And yet, society handed his victim back to him. This emboldened him. In the weeks following the Konerak incident, Dahmer went on a rampage, killing 5 more men in less than 2 months. He felt untouchable. He believed he was invisible to the law. But the facade had to crack. On July 22, 1991, Dahmer approached 3 men on the street and offered them money for photos. One of them, 32-year-old Tracy Edwards, agreed. Edwards followed Dahmer back to apartment 213. As soon as he entered, he noticed the smell. It hit him like a physical wall. Dahmer tried to keep him calm, but Edwards noticed the strange behavior. Dahmer handcuffed one of Edwards' wrists. He pulled a knife. He told Edwards he was going to eat his heart. For hours, Tracy Edwards was trapped in that apartment. He saw the blue barrel. He saw the photos of dead bodies on the wall. But Edwards was different. He stayed calm. He played along. He told Dahmer he was his friend. He waited for a single moment of distraction. When Dahmer looked away, Edwards punched him and ran. He burst out of the apartment, shirtless and with handcuffs dangling from one wrist, and flagged down a patrol car. This time the police listened. Edwards led the officers back to the apartment. One officer, looking around the cluttered, foul-smelling room, opened a drawer to look for the key to the handcuffs. Inside he found Polaroids. Dozens of them. Photos of dismembered bodies in various stages of decomposition. The officer held up the photos and signaled to his partner. The jig was up. Dahmer tried to fight, but he was pinned to the floor. "For what I did, I should be dead," he mumbled as they led him away. When the crime scene investigators arrived, they found a house of horrors that defied comprehension. In the refrigerator, they found a human head. In the freezer, human hearts. In the blue barrel, dissolving torsos. They found 7 skulls in the bedroom. They found a skeleton in the drawer. In total, the remains of 11 men were found scattered throughout the small apartment. The city of Milwaukee and the entire world went into shock. The trial was a media circus. Dahmer pleaded guilty but insane. He wanted the world to know he couldn't help himself, that he was sick. His defense team detailed the necrophilia, the cannibalism, the desperate loneliness that drove him to try and create zombies. But the jury didn't buy the insanity plea. They saw a man who was calculated, who planned his crimes, and who lied to the police to cover his tracks. In 1992, Jeffrey Dahmer was convicted of 15 murders and sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms. A 16th life term was added later for the murder of Stephen Hicks in Ohio. Dahmer was sent to the Columbia Correctional Institution. He adapted to prison life, claiming to have found God. He gave interviews, speaking in that same flat, monotonous voice about his compulsion to kill. He became a celebrity of the macabre. But in prison, he was not the hunter. He was the prey. On November 28, 1994, Dahmer was assigned to work duty in the prison gym bathrooms with 2 other inmates, Jesse Anderson and Christopher Scarver. The guards left them unsupervised for 20 minutes. Christopher Scarver, a man suffering from schizophrenia who believed he was the son of God, had concealed a metal bar from a piece of weight equipment in his clothes. He confronted Dahmer. He held up a newspaper clipping about Dahmer's crimes and asked him if it was true. Dahmer tried to look for the door, but he was cornered. Scarver beat him to death with the metal bar. Jeffrey Dahmer, the man who had dismembered 17 human beings, died on a cold concrete floor, bludgeoned by a fellow inmate. The death of Jeffrey Dahmer brought a sense of finality, but it did not bring closure. The scars on Milwaukee remained. The police department faced a massive reckoning. Officers Balcerzak and Gabrish were fired, though they were later reinstated with back pay, a fact that remains a source of anger for the victims' families to this day. The apartment building was demolished. Today it is just an empty lot, a grassy field where no one wants to build. The story of Jeffrey Dahmer is often remembered for the gore, the cannibalism, the acid, the skulls. But the true horror lies in the silence that surrounded him. It lies in the neighbors who called for help and were ignored. It lies in the young men who vanished from gay bars and were never looked for because they were marginalized. It lies in the fact that a 14-year-old boy was bleeding in an alleyway, and the people sworn to protect him walked him back to his executioner. Dahmer was a monster, yes. But he was a monster who was allowed to exist because of the failures of the world around him. His legacy is a warning that evil doesn't always look like a demon. Sometimes it looks like a polite, quiet neighbor. And a warning that when we choose to look away, when we choose to ignore the marginalized and the vulnerable, we open the door for that evil to walk right in.